Prisons don't smell like bleach or antiseptic. Not like the TV shows. They smell like sweat and sour meat, like something left to rot in the walls. By my third day, the stink clung to my skin. No amount of scrubbing in my shoebox apartment could shake it. But the smell was easier to deal with than the sounds, the distant screams that no one seemed to acknowledge, the endless rattling of keys. Then there was the sound no one explained, a scraping noise that came from the walls. They told me it was rats. I didn't believe them. I started work at Malworth Correctional Facility on a Wednesday, the same day the fog rolled in over the woods. By Thursday, it was clear I'd made a mistake. Malworth wasn't a prison. It was something older, wrapped in chain link and floodlights. The staff didn't talk about what happened there. They didn't joke around like you'd expect. They just nodded when I asked questions, their faces pale under the fluorescence. I thought they were just jaded. I didn't know they were scared. My job was to evaluate inmates flagged for unusual behavior. That's what the warden called it in his welcome speech. He didn't mention the part where unusual behavior might mean prisoners screaming in languages no one recognized or sitting perfectly still for hours without blinking. There were a lot of things they didn't mention at Malworth. Take patient hash 144, for instance. He was already sitting in the interview room when I arrived on my second day, hands folded neatly on the table, his eyes downcast. The guards called him Clay. They didn't give me a last name, but that wasn't unusual. Sometimes records got lost in the transfer process. Clay was small, wiry. His orange jumpsuit looked 2 sizes too big for his frame. His face reminded me of someone who spent too much time in the sun. Wrinkled, weathered, but his hands were pristine. They handed me his file before I walked in. It wasn't thick. Clay hadn't caused any trouble during his 6 months at Malworth. No fights, no contraband, no escape attempts. The other inmates ignored him, and Clay didn't seem to mind. He never spoke, never asked for anything. But Clay could draw. They gave him pencils and paper, and Clay used them like weapons. I sat down across from him, trying not to show my nerves. The interview room was stark. Metal table, metal chairs, one-way glass, the faint hum of a fluorescent light that flickered too often. The guards waited outside, but I could see their shadows shifting in the crack under the door. They weren't going far. "Clay," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I'm Dr. Rowan. I've been assigned to your case." No response. His hands stayed folded, his head tilted slightly toward the floor. "I've been told you're an artist," I tried again. "The staff says your work is impressive." Still nothing. His eyes didn't even twitch. I slid a few of his drawings across the table, just to see if I could get a reaction. They were photocopies, of course. I wasn't allowed to bring the originals. The guard said Clay got possessive about his work, and I didn't want to cause trouble. The first drawing showed a prison cell, standard fare, but the details were sharp, impossibly sharp, like Clay had rendered the image with a camera instead of a pencil. You could see every crack in the walls, every scratch on the bed frame. The second drawing was stranger. It showed the mess hall, but it was empty. The tables were overturned, trays spilled across the floor. In the corner, half hidden in shadow, a shape loomed. I couldn't make out any features. It was just a smudge of black, like Clay's pencil had slipped and never stopped. The third drawing was worse. It was an overhead view of the prison yard, inmates milling around under the watchtower. But something wasn't right. A figure in the middle of the yard looked up, straight at the viewer, straight at me. The face wasn't human. Its eyes were too large, its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. The longer I stared at it, the more wrong it seemed, like it was shifting on the page. I glanced up at Clay, and for a moment, I thought he was smiling. That night I couldn't sleep. The drawings were burned into my mind, especially the last one. I could still see that face when I closed my eyes. Every shadow in my apartment felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards a threat. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Prison was stressful, sure, but this wasn't my first rodeo. I'd worked with violent offenders before. I'd seen things. But Clay wasn't violent. He wasn't anything. And that's what scared me. I went back to the prison the next day, ready to follow up. The warden didn't object when I requested another session with Clay. "If he talks to you, great," he said. "If not, well, that's still better than most of us get." Clay was already in the room when I arrived, sitting exactly where I'd left him. This time I brought my own questions, and a copy of the drawing that kept me up all night. "This one," I said, sliding the image across the table. "What is it?" Clay didn't answer, but his hand moved. Just a twitch, but it was enough to make my stomach flip. He picked up the pencil I'd left for him and started to draw. I didn't stop him. It took him 5 minutes to finish, and when he slid the paper back to me, my breath caught. It was me, sitting across the table, looking pale and haggard. Behind me stood something huge, something with twisted limbs and empty eyes. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see it there. Nothing. Just the shadow of the guards under the door. "Clay," I whispered, "what is this?" For the first time, he looked at me. His lips didn't move, but I heard the words clear as day. "It's tomorrow." I stared at him, my pulse hammering in my ears. "It's tomorrow," he'd said. I was sure of it. The words weren't spoken aloud, but they echoed in my mind low and clear, as if Clay had reached inside my thoughts and planted them there. "Clay, what do you mean?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. No answer. He just folded his hands neatly in his lap again and resumed his stillness. If not for the drawing between us, I could have convinced myself the last few moments hadn't happened. But it had happened. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The guards came to escort Clay back to his cell, and I stood frozen, staring at the paper. My face in the drawing looked older, more drawn. And the thing standing behind me, its features blurred and undefined, seemed to lean closer every time I blinked. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I sat at my desk, rereading Clay's file. It was thin, too thin. No known family, no prior criminal record. He'd been transferred to Malworth from an unnamed facility after an alleged incident, but there were no details. The paperwork looked clean, almost too clean, like someone had gone out of their way to scrub the specifics. I reached out to the warden for more information, but his response was dismissive. "Don't dig too deep, Rowan," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Clay's a ghost. Been that way since he got here. Keeps his head down. No trouble. The kind of inmate we wish we had more of." "And his drawings?" I asked. The warden's lips tightened. "They creep people out, sure, but that's not a crime. Hell, some of the guards think he's a prophet. Always sketching things that happen a day or two later. A fight in the yard, a power outage, even the fire last month." I frowned. I hadn't heard about any fire. "Electrical issue," the warden said quickly, waving his hand. "Nothing serious. Point is, if Clay wants to spend his time doodling instead of shanking someone, I'm not about to stop him." I could tell the conversation was over. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I kept the blinds drawn in my apartment, but it didn't help. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, pooling in the corners like something alive. Every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. I checked the locks on my doors twice, then a third time before finally collapsing onto the couch. I didn't trust my bed. It felt too exposed. The drawing was still on my desk, folded neatly in half. I'd brought it home against protocol, but I couldn't leave it behind. It felt like a warning. The thing in the sketch, whatever it was, hadn't left my thoughts all day. Its hollow eyes stared at me every time I closed my eyes. I fell asleep clutching a kitchen knife. At 3:13 a.m., I woke to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, like nails on wood. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up, gripping the knife tighter. The room was silent except for my own breathing. Then the scratching came again, louder this time and closer. It was coming from the walls. My stomach churned as I stood, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't. Instead, I crept toward the sound, barefoot and shaking, knife trembling in my grip. The scratching grew louder with each step, until I was standing in front of the wall next to my desk. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. No answer. Then the scratching stopped. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, thick and suffocating. For a moment, I thought it was over. I let out a shaky breath, lowering the knife. And then the voice came. Tomorrow. It wasn't human. The word was guttural, wet, like it had been dragged up from the depths of a rotting throat. It came from inside the wall, vibrating through the plaster. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the knife. The wall began to crack. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, my breath clouding in the cold night air. The building loomed behind me, silent and still. The blinds on my windows were shut tight, but I swore I saw something move behind the glass, a shadow shifting against the light. I didn't go back inside. Instead, I drove straight to the prison. The guards at the gate gave me strange looks, but they let me through after a brief call to the warden. By the time I reached my office, dawn was breaking, the pale light creeping over the trees. Clay was waiting for me. He sat in the chair across from my desk, his hands folded neatly in his lap. There were no guards, no sign of how he'd gotten there. My breath caught as I stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind me. "You were in my apartment," I said, though I wasn't sure how I knew. "Weren't you?" Clay didn't respond. He reached into his jumpsuit pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the desk. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was another drawing. This time it showed the prison yard. I recognized the watchtower, the barbed wire, the rows of gray jumpsuits. But the scene was wrong. The sky above was black, streaked with red. The inmates were lying on the ground, their bodies twisted and broken. And in the center of it all stood the thing from the previous sketch, its hollow eyes staring out from the page. Beneath it, Clay had written 3 words in jagged, uneven letters. "It's too late." For a long time, I just stared at the drawing. The black sky, the streaks of red like slashes across the page, the mangled bodies of the inmates, contorted in ways that no living thing should be able to bend, and the figure at the center. Its hollow eyes seemed to shift on the paper, always staring directly at me, no matter how I turned the image. "It's too late." The words were scratched into the bottom of the page, each letter jagged and uneven, as if they'd been carved into the paper with a trembling hand. Clay sat motionless across from me, watching. "You need to explain this," I said, my voice cracking. "What does it mean? What's going to happen?" Still, he said nothing. He just stared at the table, his fingers twitching slightly, as if they were eager to start drawing again. I slammed my hand down on the table, hard enough to send a sharp jolt up my arm. "Clay," I shouted, "tell me what this is." He flinched, just barely, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw fear flicker across his face. Then his eyes lifted to meet mine, and I froze. There was no fear there, only resignation. "You'll see," he murmured. So quietly I almost missed it. I didn't go home that day. I couldn't bring myself to step outside the prison gates. The image from the drawing was burned into my mind, every detail vivid and horrifying. I spent hours in my office staring out the window at the prison yard, half expecting to see the figure from the sketch appear in the shadows. The guards went about their duties like it was any other day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the calm before a storm. By nightfall, the unease had settled into my bones. I decided to stay the night in the prison, under the guise of conducting a long-term evaluation. The warden raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "Your funeral," he said with a shrug, handing me the keys to one of the empty offices in the admin wing. I woke at midnight to the sound of alarms. The blaring sirens rattled the walls, sending waves of nausea rolling through my stomach. I stumbled out of the makeshift cot, heart racing, as red lights flashed through the narrow window. Something was happening in the yard. The guards were shouting as I made my way down the corridor, their voices overlapping in a chaotic tangle of panic. I caught snippets of their words as they rushed past me. Never seen anything like it. Not human. Can't be human. The cameras. They're all down. I followed the commotion to the control room, where a cluster of guards and administrators were gathered around a wall of monitors. Most of the screens were filled with static, but one of them, just one, still showed a live feed. It was the yard. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The inmates were all standing in a tight circle in the middle of the yard, their heads bowed, their bodies unnaturally still. The floodlights above cast harsh shadows across the ground, but there was something wrong with the way the light fell. It didn't seem to touch the inmates. And then I saw it, the figure from Clay's drawings. It stood in the center of the circle, towering over the inmates, its limbs impossibly long and twisted. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, like embers in a dying fire. The room fell silent as we watched the screen. Even the guards who had moments ago been shouting over each other were struck dumb by the sight. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered. No one answered. I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. I left the control room and headed straight for the yard. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get as far away from that thing as possible, but something else, something deeper, pulled me forward. I had to know. The yard was eerily quiet when I stepped outside. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the floodlights. The circle of inmates stood exactly as they had on the screen, their heads bowed, their bodies unnaturally stiff. The figure was gone. I hesitated, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine. Something was watching me. "Dr. Rowan." I turned sharply at the sound of my name. Clay stood a few feet away, his orange jumpsuit practically glowing under the harsh lights. He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in his cell. "What are you doing out here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed to the circle of inmates. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "It doesn't like when people watch." Before I could respond, the lights went out. The darkness was absolute, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I couldn't see Clay, couldn't see the inmates, couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to turn it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the nearest inmates. They were still standing in their circle, but something had changed. Their heads were tilted back now, their mouths open in silent screams. And their eyes were gone. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking as I swung the beam around the yard. The circle of inmates stretched endlessly in all directions, far more than should have been possible. And then I saw it, the figure. It was crouched at the edge of the yard, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. As the light hit it, it turned its head slowly to face me, and I felt a wave of nausea crash over me. "You shouldn't have come," Clay said from somewhere behind me. The flashlight flickered, and the figure began to move. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back inside the prison, but I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving, my legs shaking. The alarms were still blaring, but the halls were empty. Clay's voice echoed in my mind as I stumbled toward my office. "It doesn't like when people watch." The drawing was still on my desk when I got there, the one Clay had given me earlier. But it had changed. The figure was gone. In its place was a new image, the prison, burning, its walls crumbling into ash. And in the foreground, a single figure stood alone, its face obscured, holding a flashlight. The paper felt hot in my hands. I don't know how much time I have left. The prison is quiet now, too quiet. The alarms have stopped and the guards are nowhere to be found. The lights flicker intermittently, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. I've barricaded myself in my office, but I can feel it watching me. The air is thick, suffocating, and the walls seem to breathe around me. The drawing is still on my desk, but I can't bring myself to look at it anymore. I know it's changed again. I know it shows me. Outside, the scraping has started again. It's getting closer,